So hello and a very warm welcome to the first in a brand new series of much anticipated podcasts in Obstetrics and Gynaecology. My name's Ed Wallet and I'm very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Kenga Sivaraja, who is, like me, an F2 in Oxford. What are you doing at the moment? What rotation are you doing?
My research job.
Research? Interesting. But Kenga wants to do obstetrics and gynaecology, which is why she's here doing the podcast with us today. So what's the purpose of these podcasts? Well, as with all podcasts from PodMedics, what we're trying to do is give you a sort of basic overview of the core concepts that you need to understand in order to complete your undergraduate training. And we also want to give you a sort of firm grounding with some basic sort of concepts and stuff like that to sort of get you off the ground. In terms of supporting materials, as always, you can watch this podcast online, www.podmedics.com, get it through iTunes, and if you're a PodMedics Plus subscriber, there'll be questions and all sorts of things like that. What I thought we just briefly talk about before we start this is what is the sort of recommended textbook. I mean, obviously podcasts are better than textbooks, otherwise I wouldn't be doing them. But there is definitely one book that stands out. Would you not agree?
Yes. Ed's going to introduce it to you.
And it's Obstetrics and Gynaecology by Lawrence Impey, who is a O&G consultant in Oxford. The great thing about this book, I certainly think, is that it gives you a start. It gives you something to start with. It doesn't just dive in with all the sort of detail, but it gives you a good broad overview of all the different topics and sort of makes your experiences on the ward as such much more meaningful. Do you agree?
Yes, it's very easy to get through, and what you don't want to do is be reading, there are other books obviously out there, but they're very, very detailed, and the thing about O&G is it's simple, so stick to the simple facts and you'll understand it.
Great. Keep it simple. So, what are we going to do in this podcast? This podcast we're going to be looking at the menstrual cycle. In particular, we're going to look at what the menstrual cycle is. We're going to look at the development of eggs and the fetus. We're going to talk about phases of the menstrual cycle. This is a sort of main bit of the podcast. Particularly, we want to talk about hormonal changes, endometrial changes. And then finally, very briefly actually in this podcast, but it's something we're going to go on to hopefully another podcast, talk about some common ways that you can apply the basics of the menstrual cycle to some of the common pathologies that we see in obstetrics and gynaecology. So in the first bit, oogonia and sexual maturity. Kenga, do you want to start off by telling us a little bit about puberty?
Okay, so puberty obviously is when most girls are introduced to the menstrual cycle as such. Usually begins in girls from the ages of 11 to 15. That's usually in the kind of Western population. Obviously in developing countries it can vary. And it's often related to BMI and nutritional status. I will go on to talk about why BMI and nutritional status is very kind of closely linked with the menstrual cycle, but that unfortunately will be in another podcast. So the process of kind of obtaining a period is called menarche, and it's usually preceded by adrenarche and thalarche. Okay, and they're the processes of basically adrenarche is growing hair in kind of pubic areas, axillary areas, and thalarche is the growing of long bones.
Okay. What about the eggs, though? I mean, this is quite sort of complicated, isn't it?
Yes, it is quite complicated. I mean, basically what you should understand is that eggs, as Ed calls them, in O&G we call them oogonia. This is a process that started in the fetus. So when you're, fetus in the mother, it started long before you're even born. And what happens is that women are born with an absolute number of oogonia, okay? And that obviously declines from when you're born to kind of, as you get older. And when you get to about 37, they start kind of, declining in an accelerated level. And
is this the reason that it's often difficult past that age to conceive?
Yes, and this is what they call the ticking of the biological clock. Okay. It's actually true, it's not a myth. from the age of 37, your kind of decline becomes massively steep. So when you get to about, say, 60, you usually have run out of eggs.
And just a bit more sort of detail about it. Can you talk us through this diagram?
The process of kind of the development of the egg, or oogonia, is called oogenesis. And actually, interestingly, they don't start by being in the ovary as people think they do. They start in the wall of something called the primary yolk sac. You don't actually need to know anything about that, but it's important in embryology. And what happens is these oogonia, they kind of start in the wall of the primary yolk sac and they migrate to the ovaries where the process of maturation begins. And the oogonia basically start dividing in the process of mitosis, which, as you know, is an increase in number. So, you kind of develop lots of oogonia. And then the process of mitosis is actually kind of completed before birth, so that's where the complete number comes in. So we have all the number of oogonia. Then what they do is they become primary oocytes, okay? And as you can see, they kind of maintain the same number of sex chromosomes, and this is done by a process of meiosis. So that's a process of sex cell division. You start off with a diploid number of chromosomes, and then you end up with a haploid number of chromosomes.
So diploid is the complete number, so the complete set of 23. Twice.
Yeah. So
and then
46,
haploid is half.
Yeah, it's half. And obviously you do want to end up with half, because what happens in fertilization is that your sperm will also have 23, and then you'll get the 23 and the 23, and that will equal 46. So you have half a number of chromosomes from your father and half a number of chromosomes from your mother.
Yeah.
So the process of oogenesis basically starts off with mitosis, and then it goes on to meiosis. So when you get the primary oocyte, you begin meiosis while you're a fetus, and then you actually complete meiosis 1 when you ovulate your egg. So that's years later, okay? And then the second meiosis happens when you actually get fertilization of that egg. So in the majority of eggs, you won't get the second meiosis being completed. And what happens with the extra chromosomes, you wonder? Well, they become the polar bodies, so they just get extruded as polar bodies.
Okay, so that's the basics of oogenesis. What about the sort of hormonal changes that occur in puberty, just to give this whole topic a bit more colour?
Okay, so we're trying to link all this in, basically. So you start off, you're born, you have your absolute number of kind of oocytes, primary oocytes, and they're still going through their primary meiosis. Then what happens is, before puberty, your levels of what they call gonadotrophins.
What are those?
Those are sex hormones, okay? They remain very low, okay? So when you're a child, your body is actually, apart from obviously, that kind of outer external genitalia, your body's very similar to girls and boys, very similar. So then nearer puberty, what happens is that there's a hormone called gonadotrophin releasing hormone, okay? And that's increasingly released from the hypothalamus. Now, if you remember back to endocrinology, hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary in the brain, okay? So any hormone that's released from the hypothalamus usually controls something in the anterior pituitary. In the case of gonadotrophin releasing hormone, it controls FSH and LH release from the anterior pituitary.
Which are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, this gonadotrophin releasing hormone isn't just released, kind of continuously. It's released in pulses, okay, at 90-minute intervals. And as you reach kind of nearer puberty, this increases in amplitude, but not frequency. Okay, and that's important to remember. Also, it's important to remember that if you get continuous release of GnRH, then you actually don't get the release of FSH and LH.
So it has to be pulsatile to work properly?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to ask why that is.
We'll go on to that when we talk about amenorrhea. Okay,
so next we're going to move on to talk about the various phases of the menstrual cycle. And this is the real sort of key, I guess, message from this first podcast. So this is a familiar diagram, I'm sure. Could you just talk us through this?
Okay, so there's the hypothalamus, obviously it's in the brain, and you get your gonadotrophin releasing hormone released in pulses, 90-minute intervals, okay? That then goes to the anterior pituitary, and you get the release of LH and FSH.
Which are the gonadotrophins.
Yeah. And then they obviously act on the ovaries. They have different functions, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
But they act on the kind of ovaries, and they cause the development of the oocytes and obviously estrogen secretion, which is important in women.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a diagram basically kind of showing the stages of the hormone release. Now, we all know that what happens in the menstrual cycle is that you get kind of elevated secretions of certain hormones at certain times, causing basically the egg to be released. And then these hormones start dropping down in levels. And if you don't get fertilization, then obviously at the end you get kind of a decrease in all hormones and you get menstruation.
But what about the particular action of the hormones? What do these hormones actually do?
Okay, so follicle stimulating hormone says what it does on the tin.
Yeah.
It stimulates primary oocytes. So
well, maybe does what it says on the tin.
Yeah.
Come on.
It leads to the eventual development of the Graafian follicle, okay? And we'll talk about what the Graafian follicle is later. Basically, it matures the eggs, okay, for ovulation so that they can be fertilized and prepares them for meiosis too. And then it also increases luteinizing hormone receptors, which is important, obviously, because it allows LH to act on the ovary. Now, LH acts on the fecal cells of the ovary, and what happens is LH actually produces androgens, right? And as we all know from endocrinology, androgens can be converted to estrogens by aromatization.
Yeah, and that happens in the granulosa cells.
Yes.
Yeah. So, this diagram, possibly the key slide.
The
of
diagram.
The diagram
of O&G.
The diagram to know.
Yes.
And I think, it's worth saying with this diagram, there's sort of 3 key perspectives that you need to look at the menstrual cycle from. You need to look at it in terms of the hormones, as we've already spoken about, and you'll see on the hormone, the middle panel there, it roughly mirrors the diagram we saw before. You need to know how those hormones then affect 2 other things, both the ovarian histology, so how the ovary changes during the cycle, and also the endometrial histology. So could you just give us a sort of potted tour through the cycle?
Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to start talking about the hormone levels, okay? Because I think that's probably the most complex kind of thing about all of this, and the most important. So what we have initially is you start off with actual menstruation. It's odd, but that's how the menstrual cycle starts.
So day 1 of the menstrual
diagrams
cycle is the first bit of bleeding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you get to about kind of, usually in women it lasts for about four days, and then you start off. So from day 1 to 8, you start off with a follicular phase. Okay, so if you look at the hormone levels, now what follicular phase is basically is that the levels of estrogen are low, right? So estradiol is the same thing as estrogen, obviously, and the levels are low, and then basically you get an increase in LH and FSH. Okay, so because estrogen is low, it doesn't negatively feed back onto LH and FSH, so they start to rise, okay? And that's obviously from GnRH released from the hypothalamus.
Okay. And what effect does that FSH have, and the LH in that phase?
So FSH is stimulating the growth of primary oocytes, okay? So it's selecting from kind of certain oocytes and they're starting to mature. Okay? And what, unfortunately, the system isn't efficient, okay? So it's selecting from quite a few of them, and then some of them will go on to be, one will end up as the Graafian follicle, but obviously a lot of them will start to mature, and that's where you get the wastage, obviously.
Okay, so lots of eggs, actually, not just one that's targeted, lots of different eggs develop.
Yeah. And then LH starts increasing the levels of estrogen, as we discussed earlier. So it's acting on the fecal cells, it's producing androgens, they're being aromatized, and you're getting estrogen increase, okay?
Okay, so that gradually occurs there's a gradual rise during the follicular phase of the estrogen.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, as we can see, so from about day 6 to 13, if we look at the bottom of the endometrial histology, the reason why we call this the proliferative phase is that actually the endometrium is now regenerating and proliferating again because of the increasing rise of estrogen.
So the thickness of the endometrium, that's usually proportional to the level of estrogen. Those things are usually directly related. Yeah.
Okay, so then you get an increase in estrogen, which then starts to negatively feed back on LH and FSH. Okay, so they've kind of shot themselves in the foot because they've just increased estrogen, but that's going to negatively feed back onto the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to decrease their levels. Okay. And then eventually what happens is that this is a bit more complex, but you get such a rise in estrogen because you're still getting the kind of fecal cells producing androgens and eventually producing estrogen, that then this actually causes a massive rise in estrogen, which then causes a acutely positive feedback on LH and FSH.
Okay, and that's when you get a spike.
Yeah, so you get this massive LH surge, if we can see from the diagram. There's a massive surge in the green line, okay? And then you get a much smaller surge in the FSH. And what happens, obviously, after this is that you get ovulation.
Okay, so that is the key thing. That surge of LH, that positive feedback from the estradiol, is the thing that stimulates, from the ovarian point of view, ovulation.
Yeah. And it's debated about exactly how many hours ovulation occurs after the LH surge. I mean, I've read from 12 to 36 hours, but it definitely occurs after the LH surge.
Okay. So then where do we go after that?
Okay, and then after that, we're going on to the from days 14 to 29. Okay, so you've had your surge of LH, you've had your ovulation, and then the follicle begins to degenerate and becomes the corpus luteum, as we can see above. Okay, and I'll talk about what happens in the corpus luteum later, but we call this the luteal phase because
Makes
obviously.
Sense.
Corpus luteum.
Yeah.
And this phase is actually the constant phase of the menstrual cycle.
Okay, this is the fixed phase.
Yeah. The follicular phase isn't always fixed, but the luteal phase is always fixed.
So what sort of things determine the length of the follicular phase then?
Basically kind of, changes in hormones, the length of, certain women's, actual menstruation, things like that.
Okay, but once ovulation has occurred, after that things are steady.
Yeah.
And there aren't really any changes in the time span after that.
Yeah.
Okay, so can we now focus in just a little bit on the actual development of the follicle? So looking at things from the sort of ovarian perspective of that diagram.
Okay, so what happens is that obviously you get recruitment of your primary oocytes via FSH, and then eventually you start to notice a dominant follicle. Okay, and that grows between 9 and 14 days.
Yeah.
Okay, and within this follicle you get large collections of fluid between the granulosa cells, and that gives rise to the antrum, and we often call that the antrum follicle. And this is the point at which the dominant follicle becomes the Graafian follicle, and the oocytes become surrounded by 2 to 3 layers of granulosa cells. Eventually, if you get ovulation and you get no fertilization, this becomes the corpus luteum.
Which is responsible for that progesterone and the fixed phase of the second half of the menstrual cycle.
And the corpus luteum is basically when the granulosa cells become luteinized, and that means the cells become larger in size, and the cytoplasm becomes filled with a lipid droplets, and there's proliferation of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, okay? And obviously you get the secretions of the hormones from the corpus luteum.
Right, okay, so those are the key players in the cycle from the ovarian perspective. So let's talk just a little bit more about the sort of that last phase. What happens if no fertilization occurs?
If there is no fertilization, what happens is there is obviously release from the corpus luteum of progesterone, and if you don't get fertilization, then this degenerates. And if progesterone levels decrease and estrogen levels decrease, you no longer get the endometrium being supplied by these hormones.
Okay.
And then you get endometrial shedding.
Endometrial shedding, okay. And what happens if fertilization does occur? How do we prevent endometrial shedding?
Basically, the corpus luteum will be maintained by the developing trophoblast.
Okay, which is the developing fetus.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I think we now just want to talk just a little bit more about the endometrium specifically. Obviously, this is a very simple diagram. This is just to sort of remind people that the endometrium is a sort of inner lining of the womb, and outside of that you've got the myometrium, outside of that the perimetrium, and just to give sort of a global overview of where these sort of things are occurring. And this is a slide, isn't it, of the endometrium? Yeah.
Okay, so the endometrium is made up of two layers. You have the superficial layer and the basal layer, okay? And there's a difference in the arteries between the layers, basically. The basal layer just contains straight arterioles, whereas the superficial layer contains spiral arterioles. The basal layer does not take part in menstruation. It never changes. Okay. It stays the same, okay? Whereas, obviously, the superficial layer is kind of dominated by all the changes within the endometrium.
Okay. And what are those changes?
Okay, so we're going again back to that ever so important slide, but basically in the proliferative stage, you get the increasing levels of estrogen and you get an increase in growth of the superficial layer. But the glands are still in a very regular pattern within the endometrium. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no secretion really, and you're just basically getting growth of the endometrium. Okay. So we get to about kind of 14 days, and then we get an increase in progesterone, okay? And what happens with that is that progesterone increases secretion from the glands within the endometrium, and it does this by increasing kind of the gland size. Basically, progesterone is making the endometrium habitable.
When the fetus implants?
For the trophoblast, yeah.
Okay. Right, and then what happens during menstruation?
Okay, so during menstruation, this is basically at the end of the luteal phase, the spiral arteries contract and there's necrosis of the superficial layer and the shedding of the superficial layer, and you also get an increase in prostaglandin levels, which increase the kind of uterine contractions to get the excess blood
and that
out.
can cause pain, can't it?
Yeah, and that's why people get menorrhagia. Not dyspareunia.
Dysmenorrhea.
Dysmenorrhea.
Yeah, okay. And that's usually, it kind of makes sense, isn't it? That's why the pain is usually at the very beginning of the period, or just sometimes even just before the period, and why it gets better during the course of the shedding. Yeah,
and often that's why there's actual real clots and things like that in menstruation, because it's actually a necrotic process.
Okay. So we've spoken about the menstrual cycle, the normal menstrual cycle, and what we've tried to do as we've spoken about it is to sort of link those three different sets of processes that are going on. So linking the ovarian process to the hormonal process to the endometrial process. And I think it's fair to say that if you really understand the links between those and how they change during the course of a normal cycle, you'll be in a much better position to understand pathology.
Yeah, so we can see from that slide that there's three things that kind of go wrong with the menstrual cycle.
Yeah.
Well, not three, but three main kind of areas. So first of all, damage to the ovary. Obviously, that's where the primary oocytes are.
Yeah.
That's gonna, obviously, you're not going to get development of primary oocytes if you have damage to the ovary. Secondly, disruption in hormone levels, which can occur, for many different reasons. And obviously, this is quite a complex process where each hormone influences the other. And if you're not getting that kind of, complex relationship going on, then obviously you won't get a proper menstrual cycle. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is the actual endometrium. And, if that layer is compromised and can't regenerate, then it'll be very difficult to get menstruation. So
that's actually a really, really useful way of sort of relating the physiology to the pathology. But we're going to touch on those things in future podcasts.
Yes.
I hope. So, quick summary. I think we've sort of flogged this to death. We looked at the very sort of the basics, the eugenesis, changes that occur during puberty. We looked at those three key systems of the menstrual cycle and how they relate to each other. And then finally, we sort of considered the way that you can sort of globally regard or look at pathologies that occur within the menstrual cycle. And I think really important concept is know this diagram, know the relationships, as it will make your lives a lot easier. So that's it for this podcast. Thank you very much, Kenga, for coming and educating the Podmedics people and me. I must say it's not a topic that I'm particularly familiar with, but thank you for coming.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, and we'll see you soon.